Good evening. I'm Yvonne Stapp for Science for the Public, and I welcome you to the third Science Civic Media Literacy Series. It's a joint project of Science for the Public in the Belmont Public Library and of the Media Center. And let me praise, to begin with, Mary Carter, where she go there. She is the librarian who has been so important in all of this, so this works so closely with us for the series. Tonight, our guest is Wendy Jacobs of Harvard Law School, and Professor Jacobs is the Emmett Clinical Professor of Environmental Law and Director of the Harvard Law School, the Emmett Environmental Law and Policy Clinic there. She's also on the faculty of the Harvard Chan School of Public Health and the Center for Health and Global Environment there, and she's a special advisor to the Harvard Law School Dean on Learning and Practice, and she is also a member of the American College of Environmental Lawyers, and the list goes on and on. So I refer you to her website, which is quite an extensive list. And Professor Jacobs received her JD with honors from Harvard Law School, and then she became an editor. She was an editor there of the Harvard Law Review. Then she followed that with a career, an amazing career, which included the Department of Justice and then private law, and then in a Boston law firm, prominent Boston law firm. And she could have relaxed at some point, but in 2007 came back to Harvard to set up and direct the Environmental Law and Policy Clinic, a very innovative place indeed for training law students and for dealing with environmental problems. She is going to tell us about this innovative training ground for students of environmental and energy law. And again, there's a great deal of information on the website. So on our event page for this and for the handouts as well, there is plenty of information. Her concern tonight is to help us understand how we can use the law to protect the environment, and clearly the need is quite urgent at this time when protections of the environment are being abandoned and scientific evidence and efforts are under attack. Professor Jacobs is providing both advice and resources so we can develop effective strategies in the public. And she is especially concerned to answer your questions, so we will be having time for QA right after this. And we are, in the meanwhile, very honored to welcome Wendy Jacobs.
Well, thank you, Yvonne, for that lovely introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here. Good evening. So Yvonne asked me to tell you a bit about my background and the work I do to set the context for our discussion tonight about how ordinary people can use science and the law to protect the environment. So she gave you a wonderful introduction, but I'm going to go back a little bit farther and tell you that my professional interest in environmental law began in my second year of law school, way back. The reason my list on my resume is long is because I'm old. So my second year of law school was back in 1979, and I did not go to law school to protect the environment. I wasn't very conscious of the environment. We had Earth Day, and I didn't litter, but I really went to law school to practice international law. But my second year of law school, I learned about Love Canal, New York. And I don't know if any of you, some of you are way too young to know about Love Canal, and I don't know if anyone else remembers it, but it was a hugely polluted community in upstate New York, not too far from Niagara Falls. Somebody recognizes it. What had happened was Hooker Chemical and other chemical companies had operated in this area and had, as many industries did way back when, dumped their liquid and solid pollutants into ponds outside of their operating facilities. When they decided to relocate, they simply covered over those ponds, and a community was built on top of these ponds. People who moved to this community did not know that their homes, schools, and parks were built on this legacy of very serious contamination. Their children started coming home from playing outside with fluorescent sneakers, which was the first clue. It's like, how are their sneakers turning fluorescent? Clusters of terrible cancers began to develop. And a few of the women in the community decided to take matters into their own hands. So this is the type of citizen-led advocacy that has inspired me for my entire career. So a number of women in the community, it's a fabulous story if you ever have time to look it up, but they tried over and over and over to get attention from the federal government, the state government, and their local government. They weren't able to do it. Back then women weren't taken as seriously, and for all sorts of reasons, they had great difficulty getting an effective response to this horrible situation from the government. So at one point, they managed to get some federal regulators there, and they held them hostage. The women took these government officials literally hostage. And so now it burst out into, the media, and Congress got involved, and because of the efforts of this community and these women, this citizen-led advocacy group, the Superfund statute was passed at the very end of 1980, and the Superfund statute is designed to both create a fund and a mechanism for addressing these heavily polluted sites where there is no entity still there to take responsibility. So these are sort of the orphan or abandoned hazardous waste sites. So it was because of the effort of this citizen group that Congress passed the Superfund statute in late 1980. I graduated from law school in 1981 and decided that I wanted nothing more than most of my classmates were going to clerk for judges. I was so anxious to go out and begin practicing law, and I wanted to develop the law under this statute, because when a statute is passed, it takes a long time before cases reach the courts, before regulations are promulgated by the agencies. So it's a long process before you actually see the impact or experience the impact of a new statute, and that's what I wanted to do. So I went to the Department of Justice, which was the only place back then you could practice environmental law. And back then, now the division I was in is called the Environment Division, but back then it was called the Division of Land and Natural Resources. So we had many sections in that group, all of which were devoted to either prosecuting laws or defending the government against actions that it had taken. So I spent several years at the Department of Justice, and I had no background at all in science, but I understood that I could not practice environmental law without understanding its relationship to science and public health. So on the job, I had to start learning a lot about science and public health, but I have no training, no formal training. So I'm here to tell you we can do it without being scientists ourselves. I had a marvelous time at the Department of Justice, a story for another day. I did a lot of very important work, because the government is a great place for young lawyers to go and do important things, because the government is always under-resourced. So I had an amazing experience. I then took a very short break and went to Seattle, Washington to learn to be a trial attorney. So I did commercial litigation and First Amendment litigation. But my heart was really in environmental law, and I was very anxious to resume a practice in environmental law. So I came back to Boston, and I joined the law firm Foley Hoag and was there for about 20 years, most of them as a partner, where I worked exclusively on environmental land use and energy projects. And again, that experience informed my understanding that lawyers cannot do effective work in this area without the benefit of other experts weighing in, whether they're scientists, doctors, engineers, economists, technologists. We need their help. Lawyers do not work effectively in a vacuum. I had another very early epiphany at the law firm. I was representing the city of Cambridge, which was an early advocate for reducing its impact on the environment. So I was tasked by the city of Cambridge to develop a vehicle trip reduction ordinance, a law that would restrict people from driving in and out of Cambridge, basically, because they wanted to hop on the T to go to jobs in Boston. But in so doing, they were polluting the air in Cambridge and causing congestion in the streets of Cambridge. We wanted to get police out of their cars and onto bikes, which they vehemently protested back in the day, but now they seem to love doing. So we got police out of their cars and onto bikes. We created bike paths. We reduced the number of parking spaces available. It was a very complex ordinance. And I had to testify about the ordinance to the city council in Cambridge. Most of the city councilors are not lawyers, and the mayor at that time was not a lawyer. So here was my epiphany. I'm testifying about this ordinance and the complex relationship between transportation policy and the Clean Air Act. And the Clean Air Act is one of the most obtuse federal environmental statutes on the books. And I'm presenting my testimony, and at the end of it, the mayor said to me, "I just want you to know you are the first lawyer I've ever had to listen to, and I understood." And the epiphany for me was, wow, it really is important that we translate complex, sort of mystical legal jargon into plain English for people. And that was a lesson I took with me. So now we fast forward a decade to 2007, when I was invited to create the first ever environmental law and policy clinic at Harvard Law School. I had a three-pronged mission for this clinic. The first prong of the mission was to teach law students not only how to practice law, but how to translate these mysterious legal concepts into plain English so that they could make their analyses accessible to ordinary people. And it's kind of funny because law students come to law school speaking English, they leave speaking legalese, and it's really hard for them to learn to speak English again and to write in English. My second goal was to teach students how to work in collaborative, multidisciplinary teams in order to solve problems. Because again, a lot of lawyers think that they're the be-all and end-all, and we're not. We're not. Sometimes we're the lead player in a project, but most of the time we really need to be in the background supporting others. The third point that I wanted to emphasize for my clinic and goal for my clinic was that Harvard attracts the best and the brightest. Yale might disagree, but I would say Harvard gets the best and the brightest students. And I thought, I'm not going to waste that brain power. Let's take on not routine matters, but the thorniest, the hardest, the most challenging problems of our day. We will try to tackle in this clinic and try to solve problems that will help ordinary citizens, that will help the environmental NGO community, the non-governmental organizations that dedicate themselves to this work but are under-resourced, and to help federal, state, and local governments. So that's what we do in the clinic, and I thought I would give you a couple of examples to make it concrete. You may know about, or you may have heard of, hydraulic fracturing. So this is a way of extracting oil and gas from very deep beneath the ground surface so that we can continue to burn fossil fuels. Some brilliant engineers came up with a mechanism for drilling vertically and then horizontally to get to material that previously was not accessible. Well, this fracking took off very quickly in the mid-2000s, and it was causing a lot of property damage, a lot of personal injuries, and God only knows how much natural resource damage was resulting from fracking. But a lot of people realized they could make a lot of money by renting their property out to the frackers. So I thought, okay, they're doing this, but they don't understand the consequences to their own health, to the environment of doing this. It's not my place to say, you shouldn't be using your property for this purpose, but I thought it is my place to say, if you're going to do this, let's be sure you understand what you're getting into, and be sure that you build in appropriate protections in your agreement, because you're an ordinary property owner. If you're considering doing this, it probably means you don't have the luxury of a lot of money in the first place, so you probably don't have a good legal team. The gas companies have very sophisticated lawyers, so the balance is very skewed. So in the clinic, I had our students first do very careful legal research and write traditional legal memos about these issues, and then we translated them into a very simple, handy-dandy guide for property owners who are considering leasing their property to gas companies for hydraulic fracturing. And our guide walks them through what it means, what kind of equipment the frackers use, what kind of impacts can result to the environment, to their property, to public health, and what kinds of mechanisms they could insist on in their leases to protect themselves down the road. I'll tell you something fairly shocking, which is people who are very unsophisticated sign these agreements without understanding them, and the agreements have some shocking provisions, such as the signer, the property owner, agrees not to share any information about the fracking activity whatsoever, even to his or her own doctor. They sign confidentiality clauses that turn out to have prevented doctors from being able to treat people who are sick as a result of these activities. So we, in our guide, alert people to this practice and say, look, here are, and I'm not going to bore you with all the details, but here are a list of things that you should be insisting on if you're going to enter into one of these leases. So that's the kind of work we do. Another example of the work we do is, in the last 10 to 15 years, more and more cities and towns have come to understand that they not only have to make efforts to mitigate their own impact on the environment, and particularly on climate change, but they need to figure out how to adapt. And how are they going to pay to adapt their communities? You know, Boston has considered, for example, massive seawalls. Well, who's going to pay for those seawalls? What's going to happen when the buildings that are built right on the waterfront are drowning, are sinking into the water, and the property owners disappear? Who's going to take care of those buildings? Who's going to protect people from the degradation of those buildings? All sorts of issues are being confronted by, or cities and towns are confronting all of these issues. So we have helped a number of them by preparing white papers and toolkits to help them think about what are the easy legal mechanisms available to them, what are the more difficult legal mechanisms to attain, and then what do they really have to coordinate with the state and federal governments to do, and what are some of the policies out there that either impede or help their efforts, and where do they find money to do the work they have to do. So we've done kits like that for municipalities and for some state governments actually as well. And of course, most recently, since the election in 2016, we have been inundated with requests for help fighting back on the Trump administration's attacks on science, attacks on the environment, attacks on our national monuments. So we're very, very, very busy. Originally, it was for us, not for everybody in the country, but for us in my clinic, it was very depressing, the results of the election. We moped around for a few months. And then I realized, there's always a silver lining, and the silver lining here is that we get to think about innovative strategies for solving problems that we never had to think about before because the problems weren't there before. So it's actually been a fabulous pedagogical experience. In retrospect, do I wish, the election had come out differently? I do, but we got to play the hand we're dealt. So this has been an incredible opportunity for us to deploy very innovative strategies to fight back. So we're actually having some fun. Along the way, the university, Harvard University, began to think about its own impact on the environment. We're a big university. We have a lot of real estate. We have a lot of laboratories. We have a lot of dormitories. We have an enormous impact on the local environment. So the university began to think about what can it do to reduce its own impact. And I sat on a number of the committees that the president of the university convened. And as I listened and thought and brainstormed about things the university could do, it occurred to me that one of the best things we could do is bring together students from across the campus, from the business school, the policy school, the School of Public Health, engineering, design, law, and faculty from these schools to work together to design projects that the university could sponsor to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to serve underserved populations, and take the credit, assign those offset credits to its own portfolio. So, and I realized at the time that it's not just universities that want to do this, but there are many for and nonprofit organizations that have set very aggressive goals for themselves, can't meet their goals on their own properties. We can't shut down the labs and tell all the students to go home, so we can never become zero emitters, but we want to make a real difference, so we can make that difference off of our own properties, create these reductions somewhere else, and then take the credit for them, which is the way the offset markets work. So I proposed this course, and for the last, I'm moving into the third year now of teaching this course called the Climate Solutions Living Lab, and it's been a fabulous experience. The students just love working with each other, learning about each other's disciplines, and developing projects that we fully intend to try to bring to fruition. So I'll just give you one example, and I always try to focus on underserved or low-income communities. So Puerto Rico, devastated by 2 hurricanes in a row, and we do very little on our end to help. There are communities, rural communities in the mountains that have still not recovered their electricity, and when you lose electricity in these places, you lose clean drinking water supplies because you need electricity to pump the water and treat the water. So there are communities that almost a year later still have no electricity and no reliable clean drinking water supply. So I tasked a group of students to find a solution, and the solution had to be based on renewable energy. They had to use, not because Puerto Rico historically was fueled by the utility ran on fossil fuels. So I said, no more, your idea has to be somebody will invest in creating renewable energy for these communities and create a steady, reliable stream of clean drinking water, but you have to do it with renewables. So this team of students came up with a brilliant idea. They did their research, and we needed an engineer to help figure this out. They found in one of the communities that there were some old hydroelectric dams that had not been maintained over the years, that were degraded but still existing. And they said, aha, One idea would be to rehabilitate these hydroelectric dams. We're not creating new pollution because we're not doing any new flooding. You know, creating a hydroelectric facility is a polluting activity because you flood an area and the flooding creates greenhouse gas emissions. But these facilities already exist. So there would be no new CO2 emissions as a result of reactivating these facilities. And by doing so, they could not only power the communities in the immediate area, but they could sell extra electricity to other communities to help pay to put the transmission lines underground so that in the next hurricane, they won't lose power and they'd be able to supply a clean, steady energy, drinking water supply. Brilliant idea, and we're now in the process of trying to figure out how to get the funds, because it's always the money. The money is always the problem. So we're trying to figure out where do we get the money to make this project happen. And there are actually a couple of my colleagues are in Puerto Rico today in meetings with people to try to set up a cooperative that could tap into some federal funds to help make this a reality. I have lots of other examples from the class, but that's the kind of work that we do. It's innovative, it's creative, it's unusual, and it's a lot of fun. So, and it reflects my interest in bringing professional disciplines together to solve problems and to help ordinary people use science and the law effectively to protect their communities and the environment more broadly. So that brings us to the focus of tonight's discussion, which is overcoming the paralysis and despair that we often feel about the environmental situation today. And it's not just climate change. It's the attacks on our national monuments, the attacks on science, the rollback of protections under many of our environmental standards and statutes. And what I want to leave you with tonight are some practical steps that anyone can take, whether it's as an individual or in a group, to protect your community and the environment. So, let's see. So this is what I often hear about the paralysis. People will say to me, well, you know, I can't really do anything about these problems. My behavior is too trivial to be of any real consequence. Climate change is a gigantic global problem. There's nothing I can do about it. It's really depressing. Or I hear, well, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an expert, and environmental contamination can really only be understood and addressed by these experts. So I don't see a role for myself. Or I hear people say, I don't have any influence on the government. It's way too big and unwieldy to listen to me or act on my concerns and demands, so I'm kind of helpless here. Or I hear, I'm worried about pollution. I'm really worried about my air, water, and soil, and I'm really worried about climate change, but I don't have a clue what to do about it. So I want to sympathize, first of all, because I feel that way sometimes too, that sure, one person alone is not going to undo climate change or undo the pollution that's out there. But each of us, if we work together, can do it. So if you just think about, yeah, I'm one person, I can't do it, but if I get 10 million or 100 million or 1 billion other people to do it, then we've made an enormous difference. So it really does start with one individual. And I wanted to offer, I'm not very good with this little blipper thing. Okay, I wanted to offer 5 easy ways to begin. And the first one is to vote. It's really easy. But in fact, not enough people vote. That's why we have the president we have. You know, environmental protection is local, it's state, it's federal, and it's international. We have to vote at all of these levels. I mean, we don't vote internationally, but we do in the sense that when we vote senators in, they're the ones who write our international treaties. So if we don't get out and vote, and if we don't push our friends and family and colleagues to vote, forget it. Go home and stay in bed. So Yvonne asked me to think about, well, you know, we all vote and we have this president, and this president has appointed Ryan Zinke and Scott Pruitt to run the Department of the Interior and the Environmental Protection Agency, and some people think they're utterly incompetent. How can the president appoint these incompetent people? Well, the president has legal authority under our Constitution to appoint anybody he wants to these positions. Yes, our Congress reviews certain appointments, not all of his appointments, but those to the cabinet, as these two are, get reviewed. But, you know, there has to be something really, really, really major for an appointment to be turned down by Congress. So it's not unusual, even if we'd had a Democratic Congress, well, I don't know what the outcome would have been, but there's nothing unlawful about President Trump appointing people we think are despicable to run these agencies. He's allowed to do that. The only way we can undo it is to vote these guys out. We have to vote out the Trump administration, and we have to vote out the senators and Congress people who approve these nominations. So voting is hugely important. The second thing that's hugely important is we each have a lot of power in our pocketbooks, right? Every day we're making purchasing decisions, and when we make decisions carelessly, we're subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. So, for example, if you're constantly running your heat and your air conditioning and you're not home, you're subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. Even Massachusetts runs on gas. Used to run on coal, but now we run on gas. I used to represent some of those coal stations, and they were great people, but it's not a great product. So we have to use our purchasing power, and we have to use it wisely. If more of us demanded that our utilities supplied us with renewable energy, it would happen. We may have to pay more for it initially, but it would happen. We don't make those demands, and they don't make it easy for us to make those demands. If more of us demanded electric cars, the industry would produce more electric cars more cheaply, but not enough of us make these demands. So we each need to be thinking about what we're purchasing, where we're sending our dollars, and how we can redeploy our money to get what we need, but in different ways. And we have to apply peer pressure to everyone around us. I've done a lot of reading of the social literature, behavioral economics literature, and it turns out that education is not a determinant in behavior change. We can teach climate change till we're blue in the face, and if your peers deny it, you are likely to deny it no matter what you learn in school. And of course, in some states now, the legislators are trying to pass laws that would prevent teachers from even teaching about climate change. So, but it turns out that, you know, because I often wonder, why are so many smart people denying climate change? Why are they skeptical? There's no dispute among the scientists. So where do we get this idea that there's a dispute? And there are two problems. One is the media. The media always thinks they have to do balanced reporting. But you can't do balanced reporting if there is no balance in the facts. So the media is part of the problem, because 99.999% of scientists say there is no dispute. There is no question but that we human beings are contributing to climate change, and climate change is happening all around us. So there really is no basis for skepticism and dispute. But it happens in large part because of peer pressure. So we need that. So there's my second piece of advice is use your purchasing power and apply peer pressure. My third is become part of the government. There are lots and lots of ways in any community to join local governmental organizations. There are conservation commissions, there are advisory boards, there are zoning boards of appeal, there are boards of health. There are lots of organizations in local government that are staffed by volunteers. Do it. and encourage your friends to do it, because this is where you can not only have an immediate impact on your own community, but you can learn more and experience more about how government works and take advantage of that knowledge. It would be a great thing for students to do. Young people should be joining these boards if they are able to. And I want to emphasize that, you may say, well, what is my Concom going to do, or what is my little local organization going to do? Well, I'll tell you, it's a lot. Because if your community matters the same way you as an individual matters, if you band together, if cities band together and demand renewable energy be sold in the aggregate to a group of communities, it will happen, and it will be cheaper. So there is a lot of power. Again, communities can make their own purchasing decisions for the community. So you could change the criteria by which the community is making decisions about its purchasing practices. So there are a lot of things that can happen if we think it through and push for it. So my third suggestion is to join local government organizations. My fourth and fifth are the two we'll talk about at a bit more length. The fourth is learn about citizen science. What citizen science boils down to is, what can you do, you the citizen, to advance knowledge about environmental conditions? It's as simple as that. There are a million ways we can advance knowledge about environmental conditions. You do not have to be a PhD geologist to do this. So again, I've put up on, have I been switching things? Yeah. So I put up this link to our website. So we've created in the clinic, it took us over a year, but we surveyed the laws in 50 states, all 50 states, and we prepared a step-by-step manual to help citizens figure out how to make a difference, how to collect information, how to generate data, and how to act on that information and data. So this is a website. You're welcome to go in and start using the manual. We will periodically update it, but it's really a great tool. I'm hugely proud of it. The fifth suggestion I have is to exercise your legal rights, and we will talk about that this evening as well. And for that, I've given you a link to the clinic's website, because we post all of our work that is not confidential. So we don't post our litigation strategies for clients, but we post all of our briefs, we post our white papers, we post our manuals, so we post our comments on federal and state rulemakings, our model laws, everything's up there, and we'd love it if people used it. Okay, so let's talk a bit about citizen science. And, I want to go back to what is citizen science. So it has about a 200-year history. It started in the birding movement. So there were organizations like Audubon that were, trying to study patterns of bird migrations. And they couldn't do it by themselves, but there are birders all over the country, all over the world, and they would reach out and say, let us know when you see something significant. So all over the world in the country, birders would send information in to these organizations, and that is citizen science, sort of crowdsourcing information. There was no internet back then. I mean, this has been going on since the 1800s. When I think about citizen science today, this stuff still goes on, and the focus of our manual is really on pollution. What can we do to collect or generate data about the condition of our environment, land, water, soil, air, so that we can protect ourselves? So that it's in that context that I'm talking about citizen science. And in most instances, the science part, as opposed to the law part, is focused on local pollution issues and local development activities. So, it may be that, you observe what you think might be contamination in the neighborhood forest. You see dead animals, you see fluorescent material, and you're wondering, ooh, what is going on here? This doesn't look right. So that would be an example of local pollution. Or you've got, you hear that a major industry would like to build a facility in your town, and you're worried about what their activities will do to the town. These are perfect opportunities for citizen scientists to gather information and generate data. So what you might do is, because you always, in pollution situations and development situations, you always need to have a baseline. What is the natural condition of things and what is happening that's different from the natural? So you're comparing what's happening now with what the baseline would be, what the natural condition would be. And it's not always clean. Your baseline is not always a clean condition. So, you know, there could be pre-existing, let's say there's pre-existing arsenic contamination because there was an apple orchard. We used to use arsenic in apple orchards in New England. So there may be arsenic all over the neighborhood that goes way back to apple orchards, but now a machine company wants to come to town and use volatile organic compounds, completely different than arsenic. So your baseline will certainly show arsenic, but you're going to want to look to see what sorts of volatile organic compounds are already in your environment, and you'll compare those levels with what happens with this new industry. Or you'll use the existing levels to argue for permit restrictions if the agencies allow this industry to develop here. So that's the purpose of gathering baseline data and information, is so that you sort of have a handle on what's going on already. And some of this information, by the way, you'll find in government files, you'll find in media reports, or you may collect samples yourself. Now you've got, so let's say you do your information gathering and you collect some samples, you now have some data, but you're not scientists and you don't really know what it means. At this point, you've got to analyze it. So my recommendation is go look for experts in your community, right? Talk to the local high school teachers, talk to the community college professors or a university in your community. Lots of people are willing to help answer questions. Talk to environmental organizations nearby, or the Board of Health, you know, might be able to help you interpret the information that you're gathering. Once you have information and you understand it, then you can decide how to use it. And your uses might range from educating people, pretty simple and straightforward, informing the government, maybe your local agencies don't know about the condition that you've discovered. Maybe you want to negotiate with whoever has created the contamination that you're worried about. Or you might want to do something more formal, like file a petition for government action. So we're now getting more into the purely legal realm. Or you might want to sue. And I always list lawsuits last because they're the most expensive, the most time-consuming, the most difficult for citizens. But this is what, in a nutshell, citizen science is all about in the pollution context. So here's an example of it applied. There's a stream in your town, and you smell something that doesn't smell right, and you see a sheen. Anytime you see a sheen, you can assume there's some contamination. Usually oil, petroleum, leaves a sheen on water. So now you've got an odor and a sheen, something's not right here. So the first thing you need to do is document what you're observing. And for that, you would walk or drive around the neighborhood to identify potential sources. And the way you would look for a potential source is, do you see outfall pipes, you know, something that's draining into the stream? Do you see drains? Do you see industrial or commercial activity? You're going to want to take pictures, maybe videotape, maybe collect samples. Here's where the law comes in. you can't actually trespass on anyone else's property to do this. So, sometimes it gets very tricky. So in Wyoming, for example, there's actually a law, a state law, that was designed to interfere with citizen science. So the law actually says in Wyoming, where it's virtually impossible to know where the property boundaries are because it's so wide open, and people don't post everything, so you don't see no trespassing signs everywhere. In Wyoming, if you accidentally cross over private property with the purpose of gathering information about conditions to submit to a government agency, you are subject to a criminal offense, criminal prosecution. In fact, the whole idea of the manual came to me when we got a call from a scientist in Wyoming who was panic-stricken and called us and said, "Oh my God, am I going to jail? I'm out here collecting data on the impact of grazing activities on waters, and I just was told I could go to jail for this." And unfortunately, the answer was, get off of whatever property you're on, go check GIS maps really carefully, and do not trespass, because even unintentional trespass results in criminal prosecution. I mean, some states are really bending over backwards to promote fracking and grazing and so forth. So that was actually what motivated us to write this manual. We checked the laws in all 50 states. We've put together this comprehensive manual to help people understand what is trespass, how do you avoid it, where are you at most risk. Wyoming is one of those places. How do you take people's privacy into account if you're videotaping and so forth. But in any event, the first thing you do as a citizen scientist who wants to protect his or her neighborhood is to document what you're finding, but to do it legally. You also need to be checking government websites, government files, media, historic media reports. You might file public record requests, which is a way of gathering information from the government, because interestingly, many industrial operations which have permits or permission to discharge pollution to the air, soil, or water have to take samples periodically and report those samples to the government. So in many cases, you can actually get the sampling data that the company itself collected, and you never have to collect your own to establish violations that ought to be prosecuted. And you do this through either making an appointment at the local agency, the Department of Environmental Protection or the federal EPA, to review the files, or you submit a public record request for files. You can reach out to local authorities again to gather information about what the source of the pollution might be, or what the pollution is that you're finding. You've got a videotape, you can describe the smell, you have some samples. Again, the Board of Health, the Department of Public Works, there are lots of local agencies that are probably quite willing to engage with you and help you understand. If they are not able to, you can then turn to state authorities such as the Department of Public Health or the Department of Environmental Protection. And there are many, many fabulous environmental organizations in our communities that do this day in and day out and have scientists on staff. I just named a couple of them here because I'm talking about a water example. We've got the Charles River Watershed Association, the Mystic River Watershed, the Conservation Law Foundation, and so on. All of these people will either already know about the problem or have great advice about next steps. And the next steps are, you have to decide what you want to do now with the information you've collected or generated. You've got to evaluate your options and develop an action plan, and we give you the tools to do that in our manual. And this is just one page from the manual. We present the information in text, in short text boxes, and in these graphics to help people understand how iterative these processes are. And again, this diagram is in the manual. So what are your options? Again, one of them would be to inform government agencies. And there's a marvelous case out of New York in which a community, another one out of New York, in which a community recently realized that they had a disproportionate number of lung and breathing difficulties in the community, and they couldn't figure out what the source of the problem was. So again, it was local action, classic citizen science. They poked around, they checked government files, and they discovered that there were a couple of industries in town that were exceeding their permit limits for discharges, and that the government hadn't acted on it, not because New York didn't want to, but they're understaffed, they're underfunded, it just hadn't come to their attention. Although the company kept filing its reports, there was nobody reading the reports. So these citizens went to New York, the Department of Environmental Conservation in New York, here it's the DEP, and they said, look, we have all these, we've documented all these illnesses, we have a disproportionate number of health impacts in our little community, we can see the problem, we can smell the problem, and we've got data to demonstrate that this is benzene coming out of some of these facilities. What can you do to help us? Well, in all candor, sometimes the agencies say, nothing, we're not going to help you. We don't believe you, we're not interested, whatever. In this case, the DEC was all over it. They said, this is not okay, we weren't aware of it, and they went out and did their own investigation. The investigation confirmed what the citizens found, and New York not only prosecuted the companies civilly, but they were criminally prosecuted as well. So this was, again, a community that did its homework and was able, they were lucky, that they were able to reach out to their local government and get a response. Not everyone is so fortunate. So sometimes you actually have to file a legal petition asking the government to exercise its responsibility to either prepare a rule or enforce or revoke a permit. Sometimes the government is already in the process of, these are called rulemakings, and it's your responsibility to participate in that rulemaking process if you want it changed or improved. So if the government is gearing up to issue a permit to a facility and you don't like the idea that that facility has permission to operate and discharge pollution in your community, it is incumbent upon you to participate and oppose the permit or ask for special conditions to be set in the permit. The third option you might have is to engage in a media campaign or undertake other education and awareness raising activities. And then last again is suing either the polluter or the responsible government agencies. And I'm not going to spend much time on these next two slides, but I spend a lot of time in the manual indicating that if you're going to collect data, generate data yourselves, you need to bear in mind the ultimate use of the data, because that will determine the quality of the data that you have to produce. So if all you want to do is bring information to the attention of a government agency, you don't have to follow super strict sampling protocols. There are ways of sampling that are very, very strict, and then there are more lenient ways of sampling. If you're going to go to court with your samples, they have to be very high quality or they'll be thrown out. So the reliability and credibility of your sampling techniques bear on what you can do with the material. So we discuss this at great length in the manual, but I won't spend the time now. Okay, so we talked a little bit about what you do in your community if you're worried about pollution or development, but we also have the situation where we're all worried about what's happening at the national level. And these rules and decisions that are being made at the national level have an impact on us locally as well. But what do we do about that? Now we're getting into big government. How do we deal with what's happening at EPA or at the Department of the Interior? So the first thing that we have to do is be aware of what's happening. We can't respond if we're not aware of it. And although newspapers are pretty good about letting us know, it's not really good enough if you want to participate in the process legally, because the newspapers often don't tell us enough information in time. So this is an example of a Federal Register notice. The federal government can't take any action without, I shouldn't say any. There are laws that define the types of action that the government can only take if it gives us an opportunity to comment on the action. But if you don't know where to get the information, then you don't know when you have to comment and you don't actually participate. So you have to know that the source of the information is the Federal Register, which you can find online. It's very easy. And you'd want to be looking for, it comes out every single day. It's a big document because the government is doing lots of stuff every single day. But what I do is I watch for the listings for either EPA or the Department of the Interior. Those are the two agencies that typically have the most impact on the environment, although the Department of Agriculture does as well. But I tend to focus on EPA and DOI. And this particular rule is really important because it's one of EPA's attacks on science that just came out. So it came out on April 30th, Monday, April 30th. It's a proposed rule. You can see the action. And if I had copied more pages for you, you would see that we were given 30 days to comment. So if you didn't find out about this rule before it was actually published in the Federal Register, you didn't have much time to file comments. So through my clinic and many other people, 48,000 people filed comments asking for an extension, that this was not a reasonable amount of time for people to comment on a hugely important rule. So what this rule does, it'll entertain you, it proposes a regulation intended to strengthen the transparency of EPA regulatory science. That sounds good, doesn't it? That sounds like a good thing. What it really does, this is what this administration is great with words, what this rule really does is suppresses any science, any report, analysis, or model that is based on human health data that is protected by privacy laws. So what this law really does is says, if you can't turn into us, make transparent all of the data underlying your report, analysis, or model, we're not going to consider it. That would exclude, so I'm writing with many of the doctors and researchers at Harvard University and the Harvard hospitals. We just finished a draft letter that is quite long and that explains how much of their work would be completely barred from consideration by EPA. So what this really does, they have another one called, Congress has one called the HONEST Act, and it's an acronym that really serves to say we're going to suppress all science. So this is their HONEST Act. This is their transparency rule is in the name of transparency, we'll just exclude everything except what industry gives us, because what industry gives us isn't based on confidential health data. So this is a really horrific rule because it undermines not only future rulemakings, but past rulemakings, because every 5 years, EPA is supposed to reevaluate the human health standards it has set under the Clean Air Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act. What happens now when it already based decades of rules on studies that can no longer be reproduced or replicated, the underlying health data cannot be released? Does this mean all of our standards get thrown out the window? We don't know. We don't know. So as a legal matter, if I don't file comments now, I can't participate in a judicial action. And that's the thing that the impression I want you to really take away from this is that in terms of the legal advocacy, when an agency, and these registers come out at the state level too, so anytime Massachusetts is going to take an action, there's a Massachusetts register. So if you care about these issues and you want to exercise your civic and legal rights, you have to know to track the agency's actions through these registers. You've got to read it really carefully, and some of these proposed rules are hundreds of pages long, but you've got to at least read the beginning to know exactly what the deadline is and where to submit your comments, because if you don't participate, you may not file a lawsuit, and you may not, I won't say you can't join a lawsuit because there are certain circumstances where you can, but you cannot initiate judicial action if you did not file a comment. So, and you can't, the idea here is that the agencies asked us for our reaction to their proposed rule. We're not allowed to blindside the agency by letting them move forward with their rulemaking, and then we sue them. So it's incumbent upon us to raise our objections before they finalize the rule, and then if we don't like the final rule, we can sue. But so this is what, I'm just giving you in a nutshell a lesson on how to file comments. If you want to see some, go to our website. But you do not have to be an expert to file comments on a rule that an agency is proposing. You just have to be clear about who you are, why your views are important, why what you have to say is reliable and relevant, and how the rule affects you, and what exactly do you want the agency to do. So in the case of the rule I just showed you, my comments say, throw it away. It's a horrible rule. It will dramatically hurt human health and the environment. There's nothing that I can agree to in this rule. Throw the whole thing away. That's my specific request. In most instances, it's, well, you know, sections A, B, and C are okay. We can live with those, but D, E, and F have some language that doesn't make sense. Here's the language I suggest you use. You want to be very specific about what you want the agency to do. But the important thing is that you get your comments in, and it's not enough to say your rule is crummy, throw it away. You have to articulate why is it crummy? What is unacceptable about the rule? Does it conflict with data? Does it conflict with the law? What is it that's unacceptable? And what does the agency need to do to fix the problem? Then you want to follow the progress of the rulemaking, because it goes from proposed rule to final rule, and sometimes there are interim developments, and again, you've got to watch for the deadlines. If you then are still miserable with the rule, you have the right to litigate, and there'll be lots of other people filing lawsuits as well, and you can join a lawsuit. Under our Federal Administrative Procedure Act, and it's the same under state law, the reviewing court is going to hold unlawful and set aside the agency's action if the action is arbitrary, capricious, and abuse of discretion, or otherwise not in accordance with law. So these are the points you're wanting to make in your comment letter. You want to demonstrate that it's either arbitrary, capricious, and abuse of discretion, or unlawful, because that's the standard the court will use. Okay, apart from challenging rules and permits, you can challenge other agency actions or failure of the agency to act. Most environmental statutes allow citizens to sue the government to enforce the laws, or to sue the government for its failure to enforce against a polluter, or you can sue the polluter directly. And this is just one example. These are called citizen suit provisions, because any citizen may commence one of these lawsuits. And the idea here is that Congress directed EPA to do certain things. EPA is supposed to set standards for water discharges, and it's supposed to enforce the permits it issues. If it doesn't do that, then citizens are allowed to stand in the shoes of the government and force either the government to act or act directly. So typically what happens, but there are very, very strict prerequisites for these suits. So typically what happens is the citizen files a 60-day notice letter. You have to give notice to the government and to the polluting entity that you plan to file a lawsuit, and they have 60 days either to fix their behavior if they're the polluter, or the government has 60 days to step in and bring its own enforcement action. That often happens, but it's the citizen who has provoked the compliance with the statute by the government. So we're going to close by going back to citizen science, and I just want to again emphasize that in order for us to exercise our rights effectively, we need to have factual support and reliable evidence to support a demand or a lawsuit. We need to carefully plan to ensure the quality of the data we're collecting. And again, I wanted to reference both the clinic's manual and that Tonawanda success story, which we talk about in the manual as well. These are some additional resources. Not only is our manual there on our website, but the ECHO database at EPA is how you would track the sampling results that people who have permits, the industries that are doing the discharges, report their data to this database. So this is a quick way to learn information about permit compliance. I gave links to 2 comment letters of the clinic to give people a sense of how you write one of these letters if you want to participate. And we'll turn to Q&A, but while we're doing Q&A, I wanted to put up some art that a local artist and friend of mine has done about the environment. She also is an environmentalist and has done some beautiful art about natural resources, and her name is Karen Lee Sobel. So with that, I thank you, and I hope you have some questions that I can answer for you. Yes?
On quite a few occasions, prompted by environmental, political, or media